We, a dystopian novel by Yevgeny Eugene Zamyatin, depicts a totalitarian society called the One State, where individuality is suppressed and citizens live under strict control and surveillance. The protagonist, D503, a mathematician and builder of the spaceship integral, initially embraces this rigid order, but his encounter with I-330 challenges his beliefs and leads him to question the one state's values. The novel explores themes of individuality versus collectivism, freedom, and the dangers of unchecked authority. Here's a more detailed breakdown. Setting: the story is set in a future where a totalitarian state, the one state, controls every aspect of its citizens' lives. One state's society. Citizens, known as numbers, live under a rigid schedule dictated by the table of hours and are identified by numbers, not names. D503's journey. D503, initially a loyal citizen, experiences a transformation as he grapples with his emotions and begins to question the one state's ideals. Impact of I-330. I-330 introduces D503 to concepts of individuality and rebellion, challenging his perception of the one state. Dystopian themes. The novel explores themes of individuality versus collectivism, freedom versus control, and the dangers of a society built on reason and logic without emotion. Loss of individuality. The one state aims to eliminate individuality through forced operations, highlighting the destructive consequences of suppressing human emotions and desires. Influence. We is considered a seminal work in dystopian literature, influencing later works like George Orwell's 1984. Yevgeny Zamyatin's We was first published in English in 1924, translated by Gregory Zilberg through the original Russian text, though the original Russian text wasn't published in the Soviet Union until 1988. The novel, written between 1920 and 1921, was suppressed in Russia for many years due to its critical portrayal of totalitarianism. Here's a more detailed breakdown. 1920 to 1921, Zamyatin writes the 1924, first published in English by E. P. Dutton in New York, translated by Gregory Zilborg. 1931, Zamyatin, facing increasing pressure in the Soviet Union, is granted permission to leave the country. 1952, the original Russian text is first published in New York. 1988, We is finally published in the Soviet Union after a long period of suppression, coinciding with the period of glasnost. Source: Google search generative AI. We, Eugene Zamyatin. The Project Gutenberg ebook of We. This ebook is for the use of anyone, anywhere, in the United States and most other parts of the world at no cost and with almost no restrictions whatsoever. You may copy it, give it away, or reuse it under the terms of the Project Gutenberg license included with this ebook or online at www.gutenberg.org. If you are not located in the United States, you will have to check the laws of the country where you are located before using this ebook. Title: We, Arthur Evgeny Ivanovich Zamyatin. Translator: Gregory Zilborg. Release date: April 27, 2020. Ebook number 61963. Language: English. Credits: produced by Andrew Sly, Mary Glenn Krause, University of Michigan, and the online distributed proofreading team at www.pgdp.net. This book was produced from images made available by the Happy Trust Digital Library. Start of the Project Gutenberg ebook. We, Eugene Zamyatin. We, authorized translation from the Russian by Gregory Zilberg, New York, E.P. Dutton and Company, 681 Fifth Avenue. Copyright 1924 by E.P. Dutton and Company. All rights reserved. Printed in the United States of America. Read in June 2025. Forward. In submitting this book to the American public, the translator has this to say: the artistic and psychological sides of the novel are hardly to be discussed in a preface. Great as the art of a writer may be, and profound as his psychology may seem to one, the impression is largely a matter of individual variations, and this side must naturally be left to each individual's judgment and sensibilities. There is, however, one side of the matter which deserves particular mention and motivated emphasis. It is perhaps for the first time in the history of the last few decades that a Russian book, inspired by Russian life, written in Russian and in the Russian language, should see its first light not in Russia, but abroad, and not in the language it was originally written, but translated into a foreign tongue. During the darkest years of Russian history, in the 40s, 60s, 80s, and 90s of the last century, many Russian writers were forced by oppression and reaction to live abroad and to write abroad, yet their writings would reach Russia, and they were intended primarily for the Russian reader and Russian life. Most of Turgenev's novels were written while he was in France, and with the exception of his last short story, which he dictated on his deathbed, all of his novels and stories were written in Russian. Herzen, Kropotkin, and at one time Dostoevsky were similarly obliged to write while away from their native land. Here is a book written by an artist who lived and still lives in Russia, and whose intimate love for Russia and her suffering is so great that he finds it impossible to leave Russia even in these days of stress and sorrow. But his book may not appear in the country where it was written. It is a great tragedy, the spiritual loneliness of the artist who cannot speak to his own people. And bringing out this book in English, the author tries to address himself to the world without having the opportunity of being heard by his own people. This situation, however, is to a great extent symbolic of the spiritual mission of Zamyatin, for no matter what the language in which he originally writes, and no matter how typically national his artistic perception and intuition, he is essentially universal, and his vision transcends the boundaries of a pure national art. Moreover, it is not true that the more genuinely national a man's art and the more sincerely national his personality, the more is he universal. Is it not true? Abraham Lincoln is more than an American national figure, and I doubt if the appeal Lincoln's personality makes would be universal as it is if he were not so typically American. It is difficult to find personalities more national than Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, and this is perhaps the reason why they stand out as two of the most typically universal minds, with a universal appeal that the 19th century gave us. Zamyatin is not so great as the men referred to above, but despite his youth, he already proves to be the bearer of that quality of greatness which characterizes a personality with a universal appeal. We is, as Zamyatin himself calls it, the most jocular and the most earnest thing he has thus far written. It is a novel that puts most poignantly and earnestly before every thoughtful reader the most difficult problem that exists today in the civilized world, the problem of preservation of the independent, original creative personality. Our civilization today depends upon the energetic movement of great masses of people. Wars, revolutions, general strikes, all these phenomena involve great masses, large groups, enormous mobs. Despite the fact that there is hardly a corner in the world today where the average man does not make the trite complaint, what we need is leadership. The world today seems, for a time at least, to have lost its capacity for producing real leaders. For our great successes in mechanical civilization, our exceptional efforts and efficiency tend to bring into play large numbers rather than great individualities. What under these conditions is the lot of a creative individuality? What the tragedy of an independent spirit under present conditions is pointed out in an unique way in We. The problem of creative individuality versus mob is today not a mere Russian problem. It is as poignant under Bolshevik dictatorship as it is in Ford's factory. Of course, the sincere, honest, and frank treatment of this problem seems offensive to anyone who prefers to be a member of a mob or keep this or that part of humanity in a state of a mob. That is why we could not see light in Russia and will probably be disliked by those whose spiritual activities are reduced to the mechanical standards of a mechanical civilization, which is devoid of original creative effort. A few words about the method by which Zamyatin tries to drive home to the reader his main ideas. It is the method of laughter through tears, to use an old expression of Gogol. It is the form which is dictated by profound love for humanity, mixed with pity and hatred of those factors which are the cause of the disindividualization of man today. It is the old emotion of the ancient Catul, Ode et Amo. Zamyatin laughs in order to hide his tears. Hence, amusing as we may seem and really is, it barely conceals a profound human tragedy which is universal today. The reader may be interested in knowing something about Zamyatin himself. Zamyatin does not like to tell about himself, and the translator does not think he has the right to tell more than I quote Zamyatin's own answer, tell more than to quote Zamyatin's own answer to a request addressed to him a couple of years ago to write his autobiography. I see you want my autobiography by all means, but I assure you that you will have to limit yourself only to an outside inspection and get but a glimpse, perhaps, into the dark windows. I seldom ask anybody to enter. As to the outside, you will see a lonely child without playmates lying on a Turkish divan, hind side up, reading a book, or under the grand piano while his mother plays Chopin. 2 steps away from Chopin, just outside the window with the geraniums in the middle of the street, there is a small pig tied to a stake and hens fluttering in the dust. If you are interested in geography, here it is. Lebedyan is the most Russian Tambov province about which Tolstoy and Turgenev wrote so much. Chronology, the end of the 80s and early 90s, then Voronezh, the gymnasium pension, boredom, and rabid dogs on Main Street. One of these dogs got me by the leg. At that time, I loved to make different experiments on myself, and I decided to wait and see whether I would or would not get the rabies. And what is most important, I was very curious. What would I feel when the time would come for the rabies, about 2 weeks after the bite? I felt a great many things. But 2 weeks later, I did not get the rabies. Therefore, I announced to the inspector and the school that I got the rabies and must go at once to Moscow for vaccination. In the gymnasium, I would get A plus for composition and was not always on good terms with mathematics. Perhaps because of that sheer stubbornness, I chose the most mathematical career, the shipbuilding department of the Petrograd Polytech. 13 years ago in the month of May, and that May was remarkable in that snow covered the flowers. I simultaneously finished my work for my diploma and my first short story. The short story was published in the Old Obrazovanie. Well, what else do you want? That meant that I was going to write short stories and was going to publish them. Therefore, for the following 3 years, I wrote about nothing but ice cutters, steam engines, riflers, and the theoretical exploration of the works of floating steam shovels. I couldn't help myself. I was attached to the chair of ship architecture and busied myself with teaching in the shipbuilding faculty, where I teach until now. If I mean anything in Russian literature, I owe this completely to the Petrograd Secret Service. In 1911, this service exiled me from Petrograd, and I was forced to spend 2 years in a non populated place in Lachta. There, in the midst of the white winter silence and the green summer silence, I wrote my Provincia. After that, the late Ismailov expressed in print his belief that I wore very high boots and was a long haired provincial type, carrying a heavy stick, and he was later very much surprised that I didn't look a bit like that. Incidentally, not a bit like that, I became in England where, during the war, I spent about 2 years building ships and visiting the ruins of ancient castles. I listened to the banging of the German Zeppelin bombs and wrote a short novel, The Islanders. I regret immensely that I did not witness the Russian Revolution in February and know only the October Revolution, because it was in October, a life preserver around my body and all the lights out, passing German submarines, that I returned to Petrograd. Because of this, I felt like one who, never having been in love, gets up one morning and finds himself married about 10 years. Now I write little, perhaps because my requirements towards myself become greater. 3 new volumes are in the hands of the publishers and begin to be published only now. The fourth will be my novel, We, the funniest and most earnest thing I have written. However, the most serious and most interesting novels I never wrote. They happened to me in my life. Zamyatin continues to live in Russia. It continues to live with Russia. But such is the sarcasm of fate that the first Russian novel, giving a real synthesis of the Russian Revolution and its greater universal meaning, this novel, written by Zamyatin, should remain unknown to the Russians in Russia. Gregory Zilborg, New York, 1924. Contents, forward, and the record. 1. An announcement, the wisest of lines, a poem. 2. Ballet, square harmony, X. 3. A coat, a wall, the tables, the wild man with the 4. Barometer, epilepsy, if the square, the rulers of the world, an agreeable and useful function. 5. An accident, the cursed, it's clear, 24 hours. 6. An eyelash, Taylor, Hayne and Lily of the Valley. 7. An irrational root, R13, the triangle. 8. Liturgy, iambus, the cast iron hand. 9. A letter, a membrane, hairy eye. 10. No, I can't let it be without headings. I'll stop there.